The 60 cycle current in our house wiring, the ultrasonic frequencies in our computers, the radio waves in our televisions, the microwaves in our cell phones, which are exactly like the microwaves in the microwave you use to warm up your food, which I would highly recommend you don't do that. These are only distortions of the invisible rainbow that runs through our veins and makes us alive. It distorts your natural bioelectricity that God gave you to run your body. But where did it all start? Where did we go wrong? And that's why I want to bring in the book and kind of work my way through it, not page by page per se, but hopefully to help you to find out where we went wrong. How did we get to this point? So I'm going to start with part 1, number 5, chronic electrical illness. The systematic electrification of Europe had begun in 1839 with the opening of the magnetic telegraph on the Great Western Railway between West Drayton and London. The electrification of America began a few years later when Samuel Morse' first telegraph line marched from Baltimore to Washington in 1844 along the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. Even earlier, electric doorbells and annunciators began decorating homes, offices, and hotels. The first complete system having been installed in 1829 in Boston's Tremont House, where all 170 guest rooms were connected by electric wires to a system of doorbells or bells in the main office. By 1850, telegraph lines were under construction on every continent except for Antarctica. 22,000 miles of wire had been energized in the United States. 1,000 miles of wire were spreading in 3 directions from Mexico City. By 1860, Australia, Java, Singapore, and India were being joined undersea. By 1875, 30,000 miles of submarine cable had demolished ocean barriers to communication, and the tireless weavers had electrified 700,000 miles of copper web over the surface of the earth, enough wire to enrich the globe almost 30 times. So picture in your mind at this turn of that time in the 1800s, we have all these wires and they're emitting things that they're not understanding yet. In the midst of this transformation, a slender, slightly deaf clergyman's son wrote the first clinical histories of a previously unknown disease that he was observing in his neurology practice in New York City. Dr. George Millard Beard was only 3 years out of medical school, yet his paper was accepted and published in 1869 in the prestigious Boston Medical and Surgical Journal, later named the New England Journal of Medicine. As far as the new disease that he described in 1869, Beard did not guess its cause. He simply thought it was a disease of modern civilization caused by stress that was previously uncommon. The name he gave it was neurasthenia, just means weak nerves. Although some of its symptoms resembled other diseases, neurasthenia seemed to attack at random and for no reason, and no one was expected to die from it. Beard certainly didn't connect the disease with electricity, which was actually his preferred treatment for neurasthenia. When he died in 1883, the cause of neurasthenia, to everyone's frustration, he died of it himself, had still not been identified, but in a large portion of the world where the term neurasthenia is still in everyday use among doctors, and the term is used in most of the world outside the United States, electricity is recognized today as one of its causes. And the electrification of the world was undoubtedly responsible for its appearance out of nowhere during the 1860s to become a pandemic in the following decades. Today, when million-volt power lines course through the countryside, 12,000 volt lines divide every neighborhood in sets of 30-ampere circuit breakers. Watch over every home. We tend to forget that what the natural situation really is. None of us can begin to imagine what it would feel like to live on an unwired earth. Not since the presidency of James Polk have our cells, like puppets on invisible strings, been given a second rest from the electric vibration. The gradual increase in voltage during the past century and a half has been only a matter of degree, but the sudden overwhelming of the Earth's own nurturing field during the first few decades of technological free-for-all had a drastic impact on the very character of life. Telephone operators, too, often suffered permanent injury to their health. Ernest Bayer wrote that out of 35 telephone operators that had been treated during a 5-year period, not a single one had been able to return to work. Hermann Engel had 119 such patients. P. Bernhardt had over 200. German physicians routinely attributed this illness to electricity, and after reviewing dozens of such publications, Carl Schilling in 1915 published a clinical description of the diagnosis, prognosis, and treatment of illness caused by the chronic exposure to electricity. These patients typically had headaches and dizziness, tinnitus and floaters in the eye, racing pulse, pains in the region of their heart, and palpitations. They felt weak and exhausted and were unable to concentrate. They could not sleep. They were depressed and had anxiety attacks. They had tremors. Their reflexes were elevated and their senses were hyperacute. Sometimes their thyroid was hyperactive. It was German physician Rudolf Arndt who finally made the connection between neurasthenia and electricity. His patients who could not tolerate electricity intrigued him. Even the weakest galvanic current, he wrote, so weak that it scarcely deflected the needle of a galvanometer and was not perceived in the slightest by other people, bothered them in the extreme. In December 1894, an up-and-coming Viennese physicist or psychiatrist wrote a paper whose influence was enormous and whose consequences for those who came after have been profound and unfortunate. Because of him, neurasthenia, which is still the most common illness of our day, is accepted as a normal element of the human condition, for which no external cause need to be sought. Because of him, environmental illness, that is, illness caused by a toxic environment, is widely thought not to exist. Its symptoms automatically blamed on disordered thoughts and out-of-control emotions. Because of him, we are today putting millions of people on Xanax, Prozac, and Zoloft instead of cleaning up their environment. For over a century ago, at the dawn of an era that blessed the use of electricity full throttle, not just for communication, but for light, power, and traction, Sigmund Freud renamed neurasthenia anxiety neurosis, and its crisis anxiety attacks. Today we call them also panic attacks. And here are the symptoms which I often see in a lot of my clients. Here's where it gets interesting. In the International Classification of Disease, the ICD-10, there is a unique code for neurasthenia, F48.0. But in the version used in the United States, ICD-10-CM, F48.0 has been removed. In the American version, neurasthenia is only one among a list of other non-psychotic mental disorders and is almost never diagnosed. Even in the Diagnostics and Statistical Manual, the official system for assigning code to mental disease in American hospitals, there is no code for neurasthenia. It was a death warrant only in North America. In Western Europe, however, half the world still uses neurasthenia as a diagnosis in the sense intended by Baird. In all of Asia, Eastern Europe, Russia, and the former Soviet republics, neurasthenia is today the most common of all psychiatric diagnoses, as well as one of the most frequently diagnosed diseases in the general medical practice. It is often considered a sign of chronic toxicity. Acute electrical illness. Now look at all the wires here in this photograph, how they traverse all the city streets. And here again, look at all these. Look at this. This was 1916. All right, here are some other images from the early 1900s, just to give you a visual. And then what happens over the course of time. This is our current day and age. These are some high voltage power lines that we see traversing our landscape. In 1889, quite suddenly, the world was being electrified on a scale that would scarcely have been conceived when Dr. George Baird first described a disease called neurasthenia. The telegraph had annihilated space and time. Many had said at the time. But 20 years later, the electric motor made the telegraph look like a child's toy, and the electric locomotive was poised to explode onto the countryside. 1889 is the year man-made electrical disturbances of the Earth's atmosphere took on a global rather than local character. And in 1889, the Society of Telegraph Engineers and Electricians changed its name to the now more appropriate Institute of Electrical Engineers, the IEE, which is now the IEEE, Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, as I mentioned earlier in this video. In 1889, 61 producers in 10 countries were manufacturing incandescent lamps, and American and European companies were installing plants in Central and South America. In 1889, as if the heavens had suddenly opened as well, doctors in Americas, Europe, Asia, Africa, and Australia were overwhelmed by a flood of critical ill patients suffering from a strange disease that seemed to have come like a thunderbolt from nowhere, a disease that many of these doctors had never seen before. That disease was influenza, and that pandemic lasted 4 continuous years and killed at least 1 million people. Suddenly, the inexplicable influenza, whose descriptions had remained consistent for thousands of years, changed its character in 1889. Flu had last seized most of England in November of 1847. Over half a century earlier, the last flu epidemic in the United States has raged in the winter of 1874 to 1875. Since ancient times, influenza had been known as a capricious, unpredictable disease, a wild animal that came from nowhere, terrorized whole populations at once, without warning, without schedule, and disappeared as suddenly and mysteriously as it arrived, not to be seen again for 4 years or a decade. It behaved unlike any other illness, was thought not as to be contagious, as received its name because its comings and goings were said to be governed by an influence of the stars. Influenza, the flu season. Isn't that interesting? See the correlation? They're starting to come together. 70 years of surveillance by Hope Simpson in and around the community of Cirencester, England, revealed that despite popular belief, influenza is not readily communicated from one person to another within a household. 70% of the time, even during the Hong Kong flu pandemic in 1968, only one person in a household would get the flu. If a second person had the flu, both often caught it on the same day, which meant that they did not catch it from each other. Sometimes different minor variants of the virus were circulating in the same village, even in the same household. And on one occasion, two young brothers who shared a bed had different variants of the same virus, proving that they could not have caught it from each other or even from the same third person. William S. Jordan in 1958 and P.G. Mann in 1981 came to a similar conclusion about the lack of spread within families. Another indication that something is wrong with the prevailing theory is the failure of the vaccination program. Although vaccines have been proven to confer some immunity to particular strains of flu viruses, several prominent virologists have admitted over the years that vaccinations had done nothing to stop epidemics and that the disease still behaves just as it did 1,000 years ago. But I want to close out one more little video on EMFs. I think it's vitally important as we're discussing not only the change in the biosphere that they've changed, so we don't have that natural biosphere anymore. It's been distorted thanks to all the satellites that they've launched. And with all the frequencies, and I've showed it in other videos, I think episode 7, I had an image of the Earth surrounded by all the frequencies based on all the satellites that they have. My gosh, it's like our whole globe is enveloped in these wires, these invisible wires, rather. And we're just being doused by all this frequency. Let's watch this for a minute.
Up to non-native EMF. And what do I mean by that? Well, what do we got here? Let's zoom in. What the heck is that? So that's an EMF tower. That's a radio tower for cell phones. What's it right next to? The water tower. The water that actually floods into thousands and thousands of homes that are using for drinking and cleaning and bathing. So why the heck would they put that tower right next to it? What does that even do? Do you guys know that water holds memory? That water is a solvent. It holds frequency. Why would they put a non-native frequency that has been proven to have negative impacts on health at a cellular level right next to a water tower when our human bodies are 99% water in molecular level? Thus, what is the agenda behind this? Is there an agenda? These are questions we got to start asking. That's why it's so imperative to zoom out and to start asking the questions, connecting the dots, getting your water source right to come out hydrated.
All right, so what do you think?